She fed a stray dog for a week. You won't believe what happened. The first time laid eyes on the dog, she never intended to offer it so much as a crumb. It was simply too pitiful, slumped in the alley behind the old butcher's shop, ribs showing through mangy fur, muzzle trembling with every labored breath. She was late for work, hair half wet, heart pounding from sprinting 3 blocks because her car refused to start that morning. The last thing she needed was a delay. But something, some silent, invisible force, compelled her to pause and look into the dog's dull brown eyes. In that fleeting moment, despite her frenzy and the noises of the city swirling around her, felt a sharp tug of empathy that nearly stole her breath. She couldn't explain why, but she just knew she couldn't walk away. She into the butcher's shop, hurriedly paid for a small packet of leftover trimmings, then rushed out to the alley and crouched down beside the shivering creature. Holding out the meat as a peace offering, she braced herself for the dog to lunge or growl or bare its teeth. Instead, it only blinked. Carefully, gently, the dog sniffed the offering, then gulped the scraps down so fast, feared it would choke. Even then, the dog's eyes never once left hers, as though measuring the kindness in her gaze. She could hardly believe she was doing this, but something about the dog spoke to a hidden part of her, an old memory, perhaps, or a deep longing for connection. In a rush, jogged away, her hand tingling with the feeling of the dog's rough muzzle brushing her fingertips. She had no idea that this small moment of compassion was about to spiral into a life-changing series of events, something so intense and emotional that she would question her own sanity by the end of it. By the time she clocked into her shift, she felt slightly disoriented, haunted by the memory of that trembling stray dog and the flicker of desperate gratitude in its stare. That night, couldn't sleep. She was used to late-night tossing and turning, fueled by a swirl of anxieties. Unpaid bills, an on-and-off boyfriend who never seemed to commit, her mother's health. But this time, her thoughts kept drifting back to the stray and how it had gulped the scraps so hungrily. She thought about how easily she could have walked past it. She wondered if it might still be out there in the cold, waiting or perhaps already gone. By dawn, she felt compelled to check. She told herself she'd be a little late for work, but only if the dog was there, only if it needed her. Yet she already knew she would likely go even if she had to risk her job. Stepping outside, the raw morning air struck her cheeks. She quickened her pace, heart fluttering with anticipation. She found the dog in the same spot behind the butcher's, lying in a shallow bed of newspapers that someone had tossed aside. If possible, the dog looked worse, as if a single overnight chill had sapped what remained of its strength. Its eyes opened with difficulty as approached, tail feebly wagging. Something about that gesture, so unwavering in its hope, so heartbreakingly grateful, filled its chest with a fierce, protective ache. She dashed into the butcher's once more, nodding hastily at the bemused clerk, and purchased a slightly larger bag of trimmings. This time, she also bought a cheap bottle of water and an old Tupperware container for a makeshift bowl. When she returned, the dog struggled to its feet, knelt, letting the dog inhale the smell of her hand before she softly petted the scrawny back. "Hey, it's all right," murmured, gently placing the food in front of it. "Eat, I'm here." And in that moment, it felt so natural, so right, to promise companionship and comfort to this neglected soul. The dog devoured the scraps with the same desperate speed as before, pausing intermittently to sniff's hands, as though verifying that she was real. The way it touched her hands made its heart clench. It was a small, raw exchange of trust, powerful enough to overshadow everything else. Her job responsibilities, the headache from lack of sleep, the weight of everyday burdens. When the food was gone, she stroked the dog's ears until she realized she truly did have to go. I'll check on you tomorrow," she whispered, awkwardly, knowing that she had no idea what she was getting herself into. For the rest of the day, could scarcely focus. She tripped over her words with customers, narrowly missed entering the wrong invoice numbers. Her boss shot her irritated looks, but she waved them away with forced apologies. A strange sense of excitement underpinned her nervousness. She felt as if she had embarked on some clandestine adventure, bound by a secret that neither her nor her friends would fully understand. Late that afternoon, she swung by the alley again. She had no food to offer, the butcher's was closed, but she just wanted to see if the dog was still there. She found it curled in the same place, shivering. This time, shrugged off her usual caution. She reached out carefully and cradled its gaunt body against her chest, letting it absorb what little warmth she had. The dog didn't resist. It only rested its head on her shoulder, eyes half-lidded in exhaustion. A surge of protectiveness swept over, and she realized, quite suddenly, that she could not bear to leave it there another night. Not like that. Impulsively, she gathered the dog in her arms. It was alarmingly light, as if half made of air. She could feel each rib pressing against her arm. She walked quickly down the alley, unsure what she'd do if someone questioned her. If a police officer asked her what she was carrying or why. If someone complained. But no one stopped her. The evening was gray, and only a cold wind accompanied her as she walked. Her studio apartment was a few blocks away. Once there, she fumbled with the key, the dog still limping in her embrace, and half-sobbed with relief when she finally got through the door. Inside, she set the dog gently on an old blanket and hurried to run a lukewarm bath, hoping to rid it of the layers of grime. She half expected the dog to panic, but when she lifted it into the water, it merely whimpered slightly and looked at her with unblinking trust. Bathing a stray like this wasn't easy. There were fleas and tangles of fur, scabs on its skin, and an unmistakable odor of stale, damp fur. But beneath that dirt, could see glimpses of a once beautiful coat, a quiet dignity that refused to be fully extinguished. Tears pricked her eyes as she gently scrubbed, watching the water turn dark with filth. As she rinsed, she spoke softly, telling the dog about her day, her life, her regrets. It felt silly, but it also felt strangely comforting. When the bath was done, she wrapped the dog in a fresh towel and carried it to the couch, ignoring the squeaky protests of the worn springs. Setting the dog down, she retrieved one of her own pillows and slid it beneath the animal's weary head. Immediately, its eyes closed, as if contentment had finally arrived. Watched for several minutes, marveling at the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of its breathing. Exhaustion overcame her as well. She sank onto the floor beside the couch, reached out to stroke the damp fur, and swore she felt the dog's heartbeat echo her own. A profound sense of peace and purpose took root in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. When she woke the next day, stiff from sleeping half on the floor, half propped against the couch, the dog was awake and trembling slightly. Cursed herself for not having bought dog food, rummaged for what little meat she had in the fridge, and cooked some plain chicken. She was certain dogs shouldn't eat certain seasonings or vegetables, so she kept it simple. The dog ate cautiously this time, its earlier desperation tempered by a small measure of safety. Smiled as she watched, still in her pajamas, hair a tangled mess. She was supposed to be at work in an hour, and yet, for some reason, she couldn't tear herself away from the simple act of offering this stray a bowl of gently steaming food. It was the first morning in months that felt good about waking up. Something about having another soul in her cramped apartment banished the usual heaviness that greeted her every dawn. She sent her boss a quick message, lying that she had a medical appointment and would be late. In truth, she could barely afford to lose half a day's pay, but her heart insisted she stay and watch over the dog, making sure it settled in and didn't need immediate veterinary attention. A quick inspection the previous night had revealed small wounds, matted fur patches, and fleas, but nothing so severe that the dog couldn't recover with proper care. Still, she was worried. She was no veterinarian. That afternoon, she went out and bought a cheap leash, a small bag of dog food, and a few other essentials. She realized she hadn't even named the dog. It was a female, at least from what could see, though it was difficult to be entirely sure because of the dog's poor condition. After deliberating on a few names, she found herself murmuring, "Willow. You look like a willow, something gentle but resilient." She tried the name out a few times, and the dog's ears perked slightly. Laughed, delighted by the response. Willow it is, she decided. Over the next week's life rearranged itself around Willow. At first, it felt almost like smuggling something precious in her jacket pocket. She'd hurry home on lunch breaks to let Willow out for a short walk and cuddle her for a few minutes. She'd pick up extra shifts on weekends, so she could afford a vet visit. She bought better quality dog food, ignoring the pang in her bank account. At night, she'd sit on the couch with Willow's head in her lap, feeling the slow improvement in Willow's breathing, noticing how her once dull eyes started to shimmer with a hint of warmth. All of this awakened in a kind of fierce, protective love she had never known before, not even in her past relationships. But it wasn't just the bond between woman and dog that made this new routine noteworthy. Odd things began to happen around her apartment, small, quiet anomalies that she tried to brush off as coincidence. For instance, one night she returned home to find a battered envelope on her welcome mat with no address, no postage. Inside was a $20 bill. She assumed someone had dropped it by mistake, maybe a neighbor. She glanced around the hallway, perplexed, but no one was there. Then, the next morning, she found a small packet of antibiotic ointment and gauze right by her mailbox. At first, she thought the landlord might have left a note or package, but no, there was no note. Just the supplies. It was exactly the kind of thing she had run out of. She'd been cleaning Willow's minor wounds with a diluted antiseptic, and she'd been meaning to buy more supplies but hadn't had the chance. She almost dropped the packet out of sheer amazement. Her mind whirred with 1,000 possibilities. Perhaps her neighbor, Mrs., who sometimes walked by with a sympathetic smile, had guessed her predicament. But it was strange that there was no explanation, no friendly note. Just the items, placed neatly where would be sure to find them. The odd gifts continued. A small knitted blanket appeared folded on top of her car one frigid morning, just the right size for Willow's bed. An assortment of coupons for dog food arrived in her mailbox, clipped from various magazines, though had no recollection of anyone rummaging through her mail. She tried to talk to the neighbors, to see if they had any idea who might be behind these gestures, but no one claimed responsibility. Instead, they all wore the same puzzled expression. She was left with the eerie sense that some unseen hand was watching over her and Willow, guiding them, or at least assisting in subtle ways. During that same week, Willow's transformation became starkly evident. Each day woke up to find the dog stronger, her once sullen gaze brightening. The limp, desolate posture replaced by a cautious inquisitiveness. Willow would sniff at the corners of the apartment, sometimes tilting her head in a strangely human-like manner, as if listening to something beyond the walls. More than once caught Willow staring intently at the door, ears perked, tail stiff with curiosity. But whenever looked through the peephole, no one was there. She chalked it up to random noises in the old building, pipes creaking, floorboards shifting. However, the sensation that they were not alone kept creeping into her thoughts. By the end of that week, felt like she was teetering on the edge of something momentous. She had grown more attached to Willow than she'd believed possible. Even her mother, who had recently been unwell, brightened over the phone whenever described the dog's antics. There was something healing in Willow's presence. Felt a renewed sense of hope, almost as if caring for Willow had kindled a warmth that stretched beyond just them, like a ripple touching the corners of her life. She wasn't sure how she would afford to keep Willow forever, but she knew, deep in her bones, that giving her up wasn't an option. Still, a curious tension thrummed underneath each day's routine, hinting that something big was coming. Sometimes awakened from tangled dreams, heart pounding, certain she'd heard Willow barking in alarm or whining in distress. She'd bolt upright, only to find Willow curled peacefully at her feet. She'd switch on the lamp, searching for the cause of her dread. Always nothing but the quiet hush of the apartment. Then she'd lie awake, her mind drifting to the puzzle of those mysterious gifts and the intangible sense of being watched. On the seventh day since she first fed Willow behind the butcher's shop, came home from a grueling double shift to find her door slightly ajar. Alarm rushed through her veins. She'd locked it that morning. She was sure of it. Keeping Willow inside was top priority, so she was absolutely certain. Had she been robbed? Had the landlord entered without permission? Her heart hammered in her chest, and her hand trembled as she nudged the door open. The lights were off, and a strange hush filled the apartment. Instinctively, she reached for her phone to call for help, but something made her pause. She flicked on the light switch. The living room looked perfectly normal, except Willow was nowhere in sight. Blood ran cold. She rushed through the rooms, calling Willow's name with an urgency that choked her voice. She checked the bathroom, the kitchen, under the bed, in the closets. Panic spiraled, the possibility that Willow had escaped or been taken swirling in her mind. That's when she noticed a faint glow coming from beneath the closed door of the tiny spare room, really just a large closet. She never used it for anything besides storing old boxes. Swallowing hard, approached the door. She heard a soft whine from within. Willow. Relief mixed with apprehension. She braced herself, then turned the handle. The door swung open with a low creak. The sight inside made her knees weaken. Willow stood in the center of the room, nose pointed toward a figure slumped on the floor. A man, older, hair silver at the temples, wearing a worn coat. He was unconscious or asleep. It was hard to tell. A small flashlight lay next to him, shining upward in a narrow beam that cast ominous shadows on the ceiling. Willow didn't growl or bark. Instead, she stared as if beckoning her to come closer. His heart pounded, but she inched forward, eyes darting between Willow and the stranger. His face was lined with worry, his skin pale. She caught the faint smell of alcohol or antiseptic. Her stomach churned. Was this man homeless, injured, a threat? Before fear could override her, spotted a half-crumpled plastic bag on the floor. Inside it were dog biscuits, water bottles, and antibiotic ointment. The same brand that had appeared near her mailbox. Her mind reeled with the implications. This man, whoever he was, had left those items for her and Willow. The question was why. She looked again at Willow, who gently nudged the man's hand with her nose, a whine escaping her throat. Steeling herself, moved to kneel by the stranger. She pressed her fingers against his neck, searching for a pulse. Her medical knowledge was limited to basic first aid, but she at least knew how to check if someone was alive. Relief flooded her when she detected a heartbeat, a bit weak but there. "Sir," she whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. "Hey, can you hear me?" He stirred, coughing softly, eyelids fluttering open. His gaze danced across the room in confusion before settling on. A surge of alarm contorted his features. He tried to recoil, but he was disoriented, and his limbs were stiff. Willow let out a soft bark and wagged her tail as if trying to reassure him, raised her hands calmly. "It's okay," she said quietly. "You're in my apartment. I found you here. I'm not going to hurt you. Are you okay? Are you hurt?" He swallowed, pressing a hand to his forehead. I'm sorry," he croaked. His voice was raspy, as though he hadn't spoken in some time. Didn't mean to break in. Door was unlocked, I think, or maybe I can't remember." He exhaled, shaking his head as though trying to clear a fog. "I needed a place just for the night. Then I saw Will. His ears rang. He knew Willow's name. "How do you know my dog?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. A small, sad smile curved his mouth. "She's not really your dog or mine. She's been everyone's dog for a while." He leaned back, wincing as though from an old wound. "I've been watching over her for months, feeding her scraps whenever I could. But I fell on hard times. Lost my apartment, lost my job." His voice caught. "I'd been following her, making sure she didn't get stuck somewhere dangerous or picked up by the wrong people. When I saw you take her, I wanted to make sure she was safe, so I stayed nearby. Left you things you might need. Blinked, 1,000 questions swirling in her mind. She felt relief, anger, confusion, and gratitude all at once. Anger that a stranger had been secretly entering her building. Relief that the gifts had an explanation. Gratitude that someone else had cared for Willow. "Why not just come forward and talk to me?" she asked softly. "Why all the sneaking around?" He dropped his gaze, tears forming in the corners of his eyes. "I was ashamed," he whispered. "I'm homeless. Didn't want you to think I was trying to harass you or ask for money or anything. And I was afraid. Afraid you'd tell me to mind my own business. Afraid you'd take Willow away to a shelter or something. I've seen how people treat strays." His expression softened. "But not you. I watched you feed her, bathe her, care for her. I was so moved. And I only meant to stay here a bit just to see if you came home safe. But I must passed out." His heart ached. She glanced at Willow, who had curled beside the man, resting her muzzle on his leg. It was as though she were comforting him. His throat constricted, and she felt tears threaten to spill. In this cramped, dusty storage room, the air was thick with an unspoken understanding. She finally understood why she had always sensed another presence, why the gifts had appeared so mysteriously. This man had been, in his own way, protecting her and Willow. "Listen," said gently, reaching out a tentative hand. "You're clearly not well. I can't just, do you have somewhere safe to go tonight? A shelter, a friend's place?" He shook his head slowly, eyes lowered. "Not anymore." An idea sparked in his mind. She wasn't sure if it was wise or if she could afford it, but the alternative, turning him away, felt impossible. She couldn't bear to see another soul, human or canine, abandoned. Not when she could do something, however small. "Stay here," she said firmly, surprising herself with her own resolve. "At least for tonight. We'll figure something out tomorrow." Stunned gratitude spread across his features. "I don't want to impose," he mumbled, but cut him off. "I'm offering. Willow trusts you, and that's good enough for me." Her voice was shaking from a maelstrom of emotions, but her conviction was clear. "We'll talk in the morning. You can sleep on the couch. I'll make up a bed." He nodded, tears gleaming in his eyes, and helped him to his feet. She noticed the limp in his right leg, the way his face twisted in pain. She guided him to the living room couch, Willow close on their heels. Once he was settled, retrieved a warm blanket, a pillow, and one of her thickest sweatshirts for him to change into if he wanted. She didn't press for personal details, where he'd come from, what had happened in his past. She sensed he wasn't ready to share, and she also felt a bone-deep exhaustion tugging at her. She herself was at the brink of tears, overwhelmed by everything that had unfolded. As the man, who introduced himself in a quiet voice as Daniel, drifted off to uneasy sleep, found herself unable to do the same. She lay awake in her bed, Willow curled beside her, mind swimming with a tidal wave of worries and hopes. Her life had changed so drastically in a mere week. 7 days ago, she had walked down that alley, hardly looking at the ground beneath her feet, absorbed in her own troubles. Now here she was, unexpectedly sharing her home with not just a stray dog but a homeless man. And yet, in some unexplainable way, she felt a strange contentment glowing in her chest. A sense that this was exactly what she was meant to do, that some cosmic thread had woven their paths together for a reason. The next morning woke early to the sound of hushed voices. She crept to the living room, peering around the corner. Daniel was awake, perched on the edge of the couch, softly murmuring to Willow. He stroked her fur gently, a faint smile on his lips. Willow gazed back at him with something like devotion, his heart caught in her throat. Daniel noticed her presence and offered a hesitant nod of greeting. "Didn't mean to wake you," he said quietly. "No, it's fine," replied, stepping into the room. "I needed to get up anyway." They stared at each other for a long moment, the air brimming with unsaid words. Felt shy in her own home, unsure of how to proceed. She offered Daniel the use of her shower, some spare clothes she had found in a box of her ex-boyfriend's things. He accepted quietly, limping toward the bathroom. while he showered, prepared breakfast. She dug around for eggs, bread, and a bit of cheese, all the while trying to figure out how to handle this precarious situation. She was painfully aware of the razor-thin margin in her bank account. Taking care of Willow had already stretched her finances. Now she was feeding and sheltering a stranger, but she couldn't turn back now. She had to trust that compassion was the right path, even if it led her into uncertain territory. When Daniel emerged, hair damp, wearing the slightly oversized clothes, forced a warm smile. She gestured to the scrambled eggs and toast. "It's not much, but—" "No, no, thank you," he said, voice hushed with gratitude. He ate slowly, clearly savoring each bite as though it were a feast. Herself cleaning up, giving him space. Willow lay at Daniel's feet, occasionally sniffing his ankles, tail wagging gently. Over breakfast, told Daniel that she worked at a local office, handling inventory and invoices. She mentioned the odd jobs she'd taken just to make ends meet. He listened intently, nodding at intervals. She could see in his eyes that he had a million stories of his own, experiences that might overshadow hers entirely. But he remained cautious, sharing only a few details. He'd been a mechanic once, lost his wife a few years back, and had since drifted. The economy had not been kind to him. He, taken to sleeping in shelters, and when those were full, in abandoned buildings or doorways. Willow, he said, had appeared to him one night as he sat by the side of a dumpster, hungry and alone. She'd been an anchor for him, a living being who needed just a bit of kindness, until he'd lost track of her, only to see pick up where he left off. As the morning stretched into afternoon, offered to drive Daniel to a community resource center downtown where he might find help, temporary housing, job assistance. He hesitated, glancing at Willow, but assured him she would take Willow for a walk and keep her safe. At last he agreed. On the drive there, he stared out the window, fidgeting with the sleeves of his borrowed sweatshirt. When they arrived, parked and asked if he wanted her to come in with him. "No," he said quietly, "I should do this on my own." She nodded. Before he left, he squeezed her hand in a gesture of thanks, his eyes shining with emotion. Then he limped away, disappearing through the center's double doors. Waited in the car, Willow curled in the passenger seat, occasionally peering out the window as though searching for him. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Found herself praying, though she wasn't particularly religious, that Daniel would find the support he needed. When he returned almost 2 hours later, his expression was subdued. "They said they can help me, but the waiting list is long," he explained. "They recommended a group shelter, gave me some leads on day labor. It's more than I had." He forced a small, hopeful smile. "Thank you for this." Nodded, turning on the car. She wasn't sure what else she could do, but she knew she wasn't about to abandon him. "You can stay on my couch until you get things figured out," she offered, voice trembling slightly. It felt unreal to speak those words, to open her life so completely to a near stranger. But the sincerity in his eyes, the grateful wag of Willow's tail, reassured her that she was doing the right thing. And so, Daniel became a quiet, unassuming presence in her apartment. He'd rise early, search for odd jobs in the neighborhood, and come home with small amounts of cash. He'd insist on buying groceries or giving what he could. In the evenings, they'd talk about Willow, how she was improving, how much her coat was shining now that she had a stable diet. Willow loved to lay her head on Daniel's knee while Daniel talked late into the night about life, regrets, and tiny sparkles of hope. The days blended into a soothing routine and found a new sense of purpose. She no longer felt alone in her struggles. She had 2 companions now, both of whom were forging their way out of hardship just like her. But she couldn't shake the nagging sense that there was more to this story, that something pivotal still loomed on the horizon. The world had felt charged with possibility ever since that day she first fed Willow, as though a grand cosmic plan were unfolding. Would catch Willow staring at the door again, ears pricked, and she'd think of how easily she might have missed this entire turn of events if she had walked by that alley without stopping. Then, one cold, drizzly evening, A remarkable moment shattered the steady rhythm of their days. Had just returned from work, grocery bags in her arms, when she realized she had left her wallet in the car. She asked Daniel to open the apartment door so she could set down the groceries, then hurried back outside. Willow padded after her, needing an evening walk anyway. She and Willow were halfway across the parking lot when a violent crash and screech of tires tore through the air. Whipped around to see a car barreling out of control, fishtailing on the wet pavement. Her heart seized as the vehicle veered directly toward her, its headlights glaring like demonic eyes. She stood frozen, instincts screaming to move, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. In a split second, she sensed rather than saw Willow bolt forward. The dog lunged at, her body colliding with his legs, forcing her out of the path of the oncoming car. Stumbled backward, hitting the pavement hard. Pain shot through her elbow, but she barely registered it. A rush of wind blasted past her as the car careened onto the sidewalk, missing her by mere inches. The sound of twisting metal filled the air as the car slammed into a concrete barrier with a bone-shaking impact. Steam hissed from the engine. Shouts came from onlookers nearby. Everything felt slow and muddled, like moving through water. Once vision cleared, she saw Willow lying on the pavement, whimpering softly. The car must have clipped Willow's hind legs in that final second. Horror erupted in his chest, pushing her to scramble forward on trembling limbs. She gathered Willow in her arms, tears streaming down her cheeks as she felt the warm, wet seep of blood staining her jeans. "No, no, no," she gasped, cradling Willow's head. "Stay with me, please." Bystanders rushed over. A few checked on the driver, who appeared shaken but not severely injured. Daniel must have heard the commotion from inside because he came sprinting out, eyes wide with terror at the sight of kneeling over Willow. Without hesitation, he tore off his jacket, carefully placing it under Willow's body. She let out a weak cry that cut straight through his heart. Sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer. Found herself sobbing, stroking Willow's ears, begging her to hold on. Her thoughts spiraled. Willow had saved her life. If not for Willow's swift action, might have been pinned under that car. She could feel Willow's heartbeat, fast and irregular, beneath her trembling hands. She pressed gently on the wound, trying to stem the bleeding, though she had no idea if she was doing it correctly. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived, along with a couple of police cars. The paramedics rushed to, but she waved them away, insisting Willow needed help first. The paramedic hesitated, torn between protocol and compassion, then radioed for animal control or a veterinary ambulance, though no one was sure how soon they'd arrive. Time lost all meaning as knelt there, rain mixing with her tears. Daniel hovered beside her, pressing his hands together in silent prayer, as though sending every ounce of strength he had into Willow. Finally, another vehicle arrived. A battered pickup truck belonging to a local vet clinic that sometimes handled emergencies after hours. A lanky vet tech jumped out, carrying a stretcher. Gently, they lifted Willow onto it, refusing to let go of her paw even for a second. Daniel helped into the truck, and the vet tech nodded for them to come along, clearly bending the usual rules out of sympathy. As the pickup roared away, felt a wave of shock set in. She was drenched, shaking, her elbow throbbing, yet she felt only the fear pounding in her chest. Willow might not make it. She clutched Willow's paw and kept whispering, "Hang on, girl, please hang on." The drive to the clinic was a blur of flickering streetlights and relentless worry. Once they arrived, the vet tech led them into an exam room, calling for the on-call veterinarian. When the vet finally arrived, a short, bespectacled woman in her 50s, she immediately set to work, cutting away fur around Willow's injury, disinfecting the wound, administering pain medication. Waited in anguished suspense. She couldn't bear to see Willow's face twisted in pain, the dog's chest heaving with ragged breaths. Daniel stood in a corner, face drawn with concern, muttering prayers under his breath. At last, the vet gave Willow a sedative and her eyes slid closed. "She's got a fractured hind leg and some significant soft tissue damage," the vet explained solemnly, "but she's stable enough for surgery. We'll do everything we can. It'll be expensive, though." Her gaze lingered on, "I'm sorry." His heart clenched. The cost. She could hardly afford her own rent, but she refused to abandon Willow now. "Do it," she said, voice trembling. "I'll figure out a payment plan or we'll do some kind of fundraiser. Please just save her." The vet nodded. "We'll need to take her into surgery immediately. You can wait in the lobby." Gently, the vet tech guided and Daniel out of the room, stumbled into a plastic chair, burying her face in her hands. Her clothes were damp and sticky, her hair tangled around her face. She felt Daniel's hand on her shoulder, offering silent comfort. They waited. A half-hour crawled by, then an hour. A clock ticked on the wall, echoing in the tense hush. Occasionally, a staff member walked by, offering a tight-lipped smile or a sympathetic glance. Finally, the vet emerged from the back, removing her surgical gloves. Her expression was subdued but not hopeless. Leapt to her feet, nearly stumbling with dizziness. "Is she?" "She made it through surgery," the vet said, voice gentle. "We repaired her leg as best we could. She'll need extensive recovery, follow-up visits, physical therapy. But there's a good chance she'll walk again, maybe even run with proper care." She paused, letting Daniel exhale in relief. "She's in our recovery area now. You can see her for a minute, but then she needs rest." Emotion overwhelmed so powerfully that tears spilled down her cheeks. She thanked the vet over and over, ignoring the knots in her stomach about the looming bills. Together, she and Daniel were allowed to peek into the recovery room. Willow lay on a small bed, an IV in her foreleg, her hind leg wrapped in a thick bandage. She was still groggy from anesthesia, but her eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. Leaned down, carefully placing her palm against Willow's cheek. A fragile wag of the tail stirred the end of the bed, and a single tear trickled down his face at that small sign of recognition. "You saved me," whispered, voice trembling. "I owe you everything." In Willow's softened gaze felt an indescribable bond. All she wanted was for Willow to heal, to return to the lively, bright creature she had become. Suddenly, the memory of that first day behind the butchers flooded her mind, and she, at how fate had entwined their paths in such a short time. A single act of kindness had grown into a lifeline, forging connections that never dreamed possible. They left Willow in the clinic's care that night, Daniel helping back to the car. She felt hollow, as if the ordeal had drained her of all energy. Still, a fierce resolve thrummed beneath her fatigue. She would not let Willow down. She would figure out the finances, no matter what it took. What happened next was so unexpected that it felt almost miraculous. Word of Willow's heroism spread quickly through the neighborhood. A few witnesses had posted about it on social media, describing how a stray dog they recognized, one who had hung around for months, had bravely pushed a woman out of the path of a skidding car. The post went viral within days, racking up shares and comments from locals who offered help. Donations for the dog's medical bills, veterinary referrals, even adoption offers. Sat stunned at her kitchen table as messages poured in. People she had never met were touched by Willow's act of loyalty. They wanted to know more about the dog, about the unstoppable bond between them. A local news station asked to interview and film a segment on Willow's recovery. As donations arrived, felt a lump in her throat. She had never experienced such an outpouring of kindness. Checking her email or social media left her teary-eyed on a daily basis. Each message seemed to reaffirm what had sensed all along, that Willow's presence was larger than life, that her spirit touched people in ways that explanation. And in the midst of all the chaos, Daniel stayed by his side, quietly reminding her of the power of gratitude and second chances. He found small jobs repairing cars in a local mechanic's yard, saving up enough to rent a room in a shared house. Insisted he stay as long as he needed, but Daniel felt it was time to reclaim some independence. Their trust, however, remained unbreakable. Willow's recovery was slow and at times heartbreaking. Visited the clinic daily, eventually bringing Willow home to continue her care in the familiar surroundings of the apartment. The dog whined in pain on some nights, her bandaged legs stiff and tender, but slept beside her, softly singing lullabies she remembered from childhood. And Willow, despite the discomfort, never stopped gazing at with an unwavering devotion, as though she somehow knew she was precisely where she belonged. When Willow finally managed to stand on all fours, a tentative, wobbly effort, it felt like a small miracle. Wept openly, encouraging her, coaxing her to take a step. Each shuffle forward was a victory, each improvement a testament to Willow's resilience and the love that now surrounded her. Daniel dropped by with squeaky toys, dog treats, or just to scratch Willow's ears and marvel at her progress. The online community continued to follow Willow's story, celebrating each milestone. Months passed, and the gloom of that near tragedy receded, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Willow could walk again, still with a slight limp, but enough to wander around the block with. The donations not only covered the medical bills but allowed to splurge on a better diet for Willow, plus some extra savings for emergencies. During this time, Willow's own life found new footing. She confronted her unfulfilling job, decided to search for something that ignited her passion. She signed up for online courses in animal care, volunteering part-time at a local shelter. Every time she saw a scared or lonely animal, she remembered Willow's first night in her apartment, and she poured all her compassion into making them feel safe, if only for a little while. One night found herself reflecting on the chain of events. She stood by the window, Willow curled at her feet, gazing out into the city lights. She thought of how the smallest choice, offering a handful of butcher scraps, had set her on a collision course with heartbreak and hope, with tragedy and triumph. She wondered if this was some sort of destiny, if every choice in her life had led her to that alley, to that dog, to that life-altering decision. She didn't know for sure, but she felt an immense surge of gratitude. Sometimes, she realized, it's the seemingly insignificant moments that contain the seeds of the greatest changes. A single act of mercy could unravel into a miracle. Their stories, Willow's and Daniel's, continued to ripple across social platforms, not in a viral, sensationalized way anymore, but as a gentle reminder of how quickly empathy could reshape a life. People shared updates of Willow's continued progress, praising for her compassion and Daniel for his perseverance. Occasionally, someone recognized Daniel from his past life and offered further help or job leads. He ended up working steadily at the mechanic's garage, eventually finding a small apartment of his own. He invited over sometimes. They'd share a meal, talk about the future, and Willow would waddle around, sniffing every corner with excitement. Though the impact of that whirlwind week never fully faded, life found a new balance. Settled into a job at an animal rescue organization, combining administrative tasks with hands-on volunteer work. She discovered a passion for rehabilitating injured strays, her heart forever bound to any creature that limped in fear or hunger. And Willow was her constant companion, by her side during every heartbreak, every triumph. Her limp became part of her charm, a quiet symbol of survival and bravery. On the anniversary of that fateful week, decided to visit the alley behind the butcher's shop where it had all begun. She wanted to walk that path again, to see it with fresh eyes. Maybe she'd buy a small bag of scraps, just as she had done that first morning. Under the glow of the late afternoon sun, she and Willow approached the spot where had first glimpsed the trembling stray. In her mind's eye, she saw the hungry, desperate dog, the dullness in her gaze. She blinked, and there stood Willow, robust and radiant, tail wagging gently. Knelt, wrapping her arms around Willow's neck, pressing her cheek against the soft fur. Tears welled up, but not from sorrow, from awe, from love, from the staggering realization of what they had both overcome. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you for saving me." And in that quiet space, she felt certain Willow understood. The dog nuzzled shoulder, as if returning the gratitude tenfold. As they stood to leave, became aware of a faint rustling sound nearby. She turned to see a young boy crouched in the shadows, gazing at them with wide eyes. He looked nervous, wearing tattered sneakers and a threadbare jacket. Recognized the signs of hunger and apprehension. Without hesitation, she offered a gentle smile. "Hey," she said softly, "are you hungry?" The boy swallowed, nodding reluctantly. Rummaged in her bag, pulling out a wrapped sandwich and a bottle of water she had carried in case she and Willow got thirsty. She held them out. The boy hesitated, glancing from Willow to. Finally, he reached for the food with a quiet thank you. His heart clenched as she remembered Daniel's story, how he had ended up on the streets, how Willow had first appeared to him. She thought of the unexpected kindness that had rained down on her own life from strangers who heard Willow's tale. A wave of determination welled up in her. This was her chance to pay it forward, to continue the chain of compassion. "Is there someone I can call for you?" she asked gently. "A family member, a shelter?" The boy shook his head, eyes fixed on Willow. Saw Willow's tail wag, the dog leaning forward to nudge the boy's hand gently. As the boy's lips twitched into a shy smile, realized with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be, that every heartbreak and challenge had shaped her into someone who would never again walk past a soul in need. She didn't know what would come of her decision to help this boy, just as she hadn't known what would come from feeding a stray dog behind a butcher's shop one fateful morning. But she knew that these small acts of kindness carried the power to change worlds, first for one life, then another, and another, like ripples expanding in a still pond. She felt Willow's warm presence beside her, a living testament to how quickly a life could be turned around by love. So extended her hand to the boy, gesturing for him to follow. Together they left the alley, Willow padding along faithfully, her ears perked, her gait slightly uneven but strong. As the evening sun dipped below the rooftops, the three of them headed into the city, guided by the glow of streetlights and that shared spark of human compassion. And with each step, was reminded of a simple truth. In the time it takes to bend down and feed a stray dog, just 1 week, or even 1 moment, miracles can happen, destinies can entwine, and the quiet force of love can spark a chain of wonders that no one would have believed possible.